I've been trucking for over 20 years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the open road can be just as cruel as it is beautiful. Some folks can't handle the isolation. Mile after mile of empty asphalt stretching into the void, nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static on the CB. But I've always found peace in it. Out here, it's just you, your rig, and the road. That's how it's supposed to be. That night, I was cutting through a particularly desolate stretch of US Route 50 in Utah, the so-called loneliest road in America, and they weren't kidding. No streetlights, no signs of civilization, just endless desert under a heavy black sky. The only company I had was the occasional coyote darting across the road and the distant glow of my headlights reflecting off the cracked pavement. It was just past midnight when I first heard the noise. A faint sputter, barely noticeable at first, just a little hitch in the steady hum of the engine. I frowned, glancing down at the dashboard. No warning lights, no sudden drop in power, nothing that should have set off any alarms, but still, the sputtering continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like my rig was trying to clear its throat. I shook my head. Probably nothing. Probably just my mind playing tricks after too many hours on the road. I had another 2 hours before the next truck stop, and I figured I could make it there before anything serious happened. Then, 20 minutes later, the engine stuttered. Not just a little hiccup this time, full-on choking, like something was lodged deep in its throat. My heart kicked into high gear. I eased off the gas, but before I could even think about pulling over, the engine died. The truck coasted for a few seconds before rolling to a slow, agonizing stop on the side of the road. I sat there, gripping the wheel, listening to the engine's last breath fade into nothing, and then came the silence, the kind that settles deep into your bones. No wind, no crickets, just the oppressive quiet of the desert night pressing in on me like a heavy blanket. I exhaled, running a hand over my face. Shit. I tried the ignition. The truck gave me nothing but the click, click, click of a dead engine. Perfect. Flicking on my hazard lights, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The heat hit me immediately, thick and stifling despite the late hour. The desert is supposed to be cool at night, but the air was wrong. Heavy, stagnant, like the world was holding its breath. I popped the hood and shined the flashlight over the engine. Everything looked fine. No leaking fluids, no busted belts. I wasn't a mechanic, but I knew enough to recognize when something should be working, but wasn't. I tried the CB. Breaker 19, anybody out there? I'm stranded on US 50, rig's dead. Anybody nearby? Static. I adjusted the dial, tried again, voice a little louder this time. Nothing. Not even a crackle. I sighed and pulled out my phone. No service, of course. That's when I saw them. Headlights, a pair of them, far in the distance, faint but getting closer. Relief flooded my chest. Out here, a passing car was a rare sight, and another trucker was even rarer. Maybe I'd get lucky. As the vehicle neared, I saw it was a beat-up old sedan, rust creeping up its faded blue paint. It slowed as it approached, then rolled to a stop a few yards ahead of my truck. A man stepped out, tall, lanky, clothes covered in dust, like he'd been on the road for days. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, his movements slow and deliberate. "You need some help?" His voice was rough, gravelly, like he'd been gargling rocks. I couldn't place his age. Something about him felt old, though his face was smooth, untouched by time in a way that didn't sit right. His eyes, too dark, too deep, settled on me, with unsettling focus. I hesitated. Something about him wasn't right. I'd been around long enough to trust my gut, and my gut was screaming at me to get back in my truck, lock the doors, and wait for morning. But I was stranded. I didn't have a choice. "Yeah," I forced a smile. "Truck just died, out of nowhere, not sure what's wrong." The man nodded, eyes flicking toward my rig. "Mind if I take a look?" Everything in me screamed no, but what was I gonna say? "Sorry, you give me the creeps, I'd rather stay stranded." "Sure," I said. He moved toward the hood with that same slow, deliberate pace. But when he got there, he didn't check anything. He didn't even touch the engine. He just stood there, still as a statue, head tilted slightly, as if listening. A chill crawled up my spine. "See anything wrong?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He didn't answer. He just turned his head slightly, eyes locking onto mine. "Looks like you're in a bit of trouble," he said, voice quieter this time, amused. "But I can help." I swallowed. "You elimre?" "Yeah. There's a place not far from here, just off the highway. I got tools." A cold wave of dread washed over me. Every instinct I had told me to refuse. There was something wrong about him, about the way he stood there, smiling that thin, humorless smile. I forced another grin. "I appreciate it, but I think I'll just wait for a tow. Shouldn't be too long before someone comes by." His eyes narrowed. "You sure?" he asked, stepping closer. "It's a long way to the next town. Could be hours before anyone else comes through." I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. "I'm sure." For a long moment we just stood there, locked in silent tension. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. But he didn't drive away. He just sat there, engine idling, headlights casting long shadows over the road. I backed up toward my cab, hands shaking as I fumbled for the door handle. Climbed in, locked the doors. His car hadn't moved. Minutes passed, then an hour. He was still sitting there, waiting. Then, without warning, his headlights flicked off. I held my breath, heart hammering. I couldn't see him anymore. The desert had swallowed him whole. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, he was gone. A tow truck arrived an hour later, and as I climbed out of my rig to meet the driver, I noticed something sticking out from under my windshield wiper. A note, written on a scrap of yellowed paper. I unfolded it with shaking hands. "See you next time, Jack." My blood ran cold, because I'd never told him my name. You'd think after that night on US Route 50, I'd have had enough of the road, and, for a while, I did. I parked my rig, took a week off, and tried to convince myself it was just fatigue messing with my head, just a stranger being weird, a coincidence with the note. But deep down, I knew better. Some things stick with you, like the feeling of eyes watching from the dark. Truckers talk. Sit at a truck stop long enough, and you'll hear all kinds of stories. Ghost riders, haunted highways, blackhead hitchhikers who disappear if you glance at them in the mirror. I used to laugh at those tales, shake my head and chalk it up to exhaustion and imagination. But after that night in the desert, I stopped laughing. I wasn't the only one. A few months later, I met Melissa Green. She was parked at the next fuel pump at a stop in Colorado. She looked rough, dark circles under her eyes, hands trembling as she pumped diesel. When she noticed me watching, she gave a forced smile. "Long night?" I asked. Her laugh was hollow. "Something like that." She hesitated, then asked, "You ever stop at the old Ridgeway rest area on I-70? My gut tightened. "No? Why?" Her eyes darted toward the shadowed edge of the lot. "'Cause I did last night, and I wish I hadn't," this is what she told me. I wish 70 through Colorado can be a beautiful drive during the day. Rugged mountains, deep canyons, stretches of pine forests that seem untouched by time. At night, though, it's a different beast. The darkness swallows the landscape whole, turning those scenic cliffs into gaping mouths and the forest into black, breathing walls. Melissa had been hauling a load of furniture from Denver to Grand Junction, trying to make up for lost time after a late start. Around midnight, she realized she couldn't push through the exhaustion any longer. Her eyes burned, and her mind kept slipping. Once, she'd imagined a figure standing in the middle of the road and slammed the brakes, only to find empty pavement. So when she saw the sign for Ridgeway Rest Area, 2 miles, she took the exit. The turnoff led down a narrow road lined with dense pine trees. The headlights barely cut through the fog that had settled along the ground. The moment she entered the lot, unease settled in her chest like a weight. The place was deserted, but as soon as she cut the engine, she noticed how silent it was. Not just quiet, silent. No wind, no insects, no distant hum of traffic. Just her and the sound of her own breathing. Grabbing her flashlight, she stepped out. The air smelled damp, like wet earth and pine needles. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally as she crossed the lot to the restroom building. The door creaked when she pushed it open. Inside, the smell was worse, stale and moldy. The overhead light buzzed but didn't turn on, so she used her flashlight. The beams revealed cracked tiles and rusted fixtures. She hurried to the first stall, not wanting to spend a second more in that place than necessary. That's when she heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside, circling the building. Melissa froze, her heart hammered in her chest. She held her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps continued, crunching through gravel, stopping just outside the restroom door. Her flashlight shook as she pointed it at the stall door, half expecting it to be yanked open. But after a few seconds, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. Melissa waited another minute before forcing herself to move. She stepped out of the stall, hand gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The restroom door was still cracked open, swaying slightly. She crept forward and peeked outside. The lot was empty, the air was still. She hurried back toward her truck, her pulse racing. Halfway there, she stopped. A man stood by one of the picnic tables. He was just standing there, perfectly still. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a hooded jacket. His hands were jammed in his pockets. Melissa's instinct was to run, but she forced herself to walk. Don't panic, she told herself. Just get to the truck. She kept her eyes on the man as she moved, but he didn't move. He didn't even shift his weight. She climbed into the cab, slammed the door and locked it. Then she grabbed her phone. No signal. The man hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he'd been before. Melissa turned off the interior lights and crouched down, peeking over the dashboard. The man was gone. Her heart stuttered. A sharp knock sounded against the passenger side window. Melissa screamed, the flashlight beam darted to the window. No one was there. Another knock came from the driver's side. She spun the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Then came the knocking, soft taps, like fingertips drumming against the glass. First from the driver's side, then the passenger side, then from the sleeper compartment behind her. The knocking moved faster, more erratic, until it sounded like a dozen hands hammering on the truck's exterior. Melissa hit the horn. The blast shattered the night's silence. For a few seconds, everything went still. Then, headlights appeared at the entrance to the rest stop. Another truck pulled in, its high beam sweeping across the lot. The moment those lights hit her truck, she saw them. 4 figures, all dressed in dark clothes, standing in different spots around her truck, frozen in the headlights like deer. They didn't run, they melted. One moment they were standing there, featureless faces turned toward her cab. The next, they dissolved into the shadows, vanishing into the tree line. The other trucker parked a few spaces away and climbed out, confused. Melissa jumped from her cab and ran to him, breathless and shaking. There were people, she gasped, all around my truck, knocking, watching me. The trucker glanced around, frowning. I don't see anyone. I swear. They were here. He didn't argue, just nodded toward her rig. Grab your stuff. You can park next to me for the night. She didn't sleep. The next morning, the trucker followed her to the nearest gas station. When she told the attendant what had happened, the man's face went pale. You stopped at Ridgeway? He asked. Melissa nodded. He leaned across the counter. We tell people not to go there after dark. Locals call them the Watchers. No one knows who they are. But truckers have gone missing from that rest stop before. Always at night. The cops find their rigs, but not the drivers. Melissa felt the blood drain from her face. The attendant lowered his voice. Next time, if you hear them knocking, don't honk your horn. They hate that. They might come back. She finished her story and gave me a shaky smile. I know it sounds crazy, she said, but it happened. Every word. I didn't laugh, because I knew exactly how she felt. Out there, on the endless stretches of road, some things don't follow the rules of the world we know. And sometimes, you get the sense that something's watching, waiting, for you to make the wrong move. Melissa's story about the Ridgeway rest stop rattled me, and it wasn't just the story itself, it was the way she told it. Her eyes kept flicking toward the edges of the truck stop lot, like she expected to see one of those shadowy figures watching from the dark. I knew that feeling all too well. We parted ways after that conversation, but the story stuck with me. I started to pay closer attention to my surroundings whenever I stopped at night. I used to enjoy the solitude of the road, but after that night in Utah and Melissa's encounter in Colorado, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. The vast emptiness of the highways, once my sanctuary, now felt like an exposed nerve. A week later, I was sitting at a diner in Nevada, halfway through a plate of rubbery eggs and toast, when I overheard an older guy at the counter talking to the waitress about the weird car he'd seen on State Route 3175. People. He was describing headlights that followed him for miles, always staying just far enough back that he could never get a clear look. That was enough to make me set my fork down. I slid over to the counter and introduced myself. The trucker, Luis Alvarez, gave me a wary look but nodded when I asked if I could hear the whole story. He took a sip of his coffee and said, "It happened last night, and I don't think I was supposed to make it here." Luis had been driving trucks for over 15 years, and he'd seen his fair share of strange things on the road. But this was different. He was hauling a load of construction equipment through central Nevada on Route 375, the so-called extraterrestrial highway. The name was more of a tourist gimmick than anything, with quirky gas stations selling alien keychains and t-shirts, but that stretch of road really did feel otherworldly at night. No lights, no landmarks, just endless desert stretching beneath a vast sky. It was close to midnight when Luis first saw the headlights in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it. The occasional car passed through that lonely stretch, usually other truckers or some tourists hoping to catch a glimpse of a UFO. But after 20 minutes, the headlights still hadn't gotten any closer. He tapped the brakes lightly, hoping the driver would get the hint and pass. Nothing. The lights stayed exactly where they were, just a pair of dull yellow orbs floating in the darkness, always at the same distance. Luis sped up. He went from 65 to 75 to 85. The headlights matched his speed. When he slowed to 50, they slowed too. By now his hands were slick with sweat. He turned up the radio, trying to shake the creeping dread. The music crackled and hissed with static, no matter which station he tried. Finally, he switched it off and picked up the CB. "Breaker 19, he said, forcing his voice to stay even. "Me kume. Is this snook going on out on Route 375? Got a tail on me that won't pass. Anyone else see this?" Silence. He repeated the call. The static hissed, then shifted. A faint voice crackled through, so distorted he couldn't make out the words. The only thing he caught was his own handle. "Longhorn, keep driving." That was when the headlights started getting closer. Luis's heart jumped into his throat. He hit the gas, pushing the rig to its limits. The headlights behind him grew larger, brighter, until they flooded his mirrors with light. The glow was so intense it illuminated the entire cab, casting stark shadows across the dashboard. The car, if it even was a car, was right on his bumper now. He could hear the low growl of its engine through the roar of his own. He honked the horn, flashed his brake lights. Nothing. The headlights stayed locked behind him, too close for comfort. Then, without warning, the lights shifted. They slid from the rearview mirror to the passenger side window. Luis glanced over and nearly lost control of the truck. The headlights were no longer behind him. They were moving alongside the cab, pacing him like a predator running beside its prey. He could make out the shape of a vehicle through the glare. An old sedan, maybe from the 70s, its windows completely blacked out. No driver. The car matched his speed effortlessly, gliding alongside him without the slightest wobble. Its tires didn't seem to touch the ground. And then the car did something impossible. It moved in front of him. Not by passing, it slid sideways, like it was skating across ice, until it was directly ahead. Luis slammed the brakes, tires screeching against the asphalt. His rig lurched forward, threatening to jackknife. The sedan's brake lights flared impossibly bright. The car stopped in the middle of the highway. Luis's truck screeched to a halt, inches from the rear bumper. His headlights illuminated the back of the sedan. No license plate. The body was pockmarked with rust, the metal warped as if it had been left in the desert for decades. The car sat there for a moment, silent, still. Then, the brake lights flickered. Once, twice. A slow, deliberate pattern. Luis didn't stick around to decode the message. He threw the truck into reverse, tires spitting gravel as he backed up. The car didn't move. But the brake lights flashed again, and the passenger door opened. Luis felt a jolt of pure terror. He couldn't see anyone step out, but the door hung open like a mouth, waiting to swallow him whole. He shifted into gear, yanked the wheel hard to the left, and sped past the sedan. As he passed, he glanced out the window. A figure stood next to the open door, tall, gaunt, face pale and stretched, like skin pulled too tight over bone. Its eyes followed him, empty, bottomless sockets that seemed to drink in the light. Luis didn't look again. He floored it, racing down the highway. He didn't stop until he reached the diner where we were now sitting. When he finished the story, Luis's hands were trembling. He tried to cover it by gripping his coffee cup, but I saw the tremor. "I don't know what that was," he said, voice low, "but when I parked this morning I checked the rear bumper. It was ice cold." I frowned. "Ice cold? In the desert?" he nodded. "Like it had been dipped in dry ice." He hesitated, then added, "And there were fingerprints on it. Long ones. Too long to be human." Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The waitress came by, asking if we needed anything else. We shook our heads. Finally, Luis cleared his throat. "You've been on the road a long time. Ever see anything like that?" I thought about the man in the desert, about Melissa's watchers. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think there's more out there than we want to believe." We paid our checks and headed back to our trucks. I didn't mention the car that had parked near the diner while we talked, a rusty old sedan with blacked-out windows. And I sure as hell didn't mention the smudge of frost on the driver's side door handle when I passed by it. Some things, I've learned, are better left unsaid. When Luis finished telling me about the car on Route 375, I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my rig with the engine idling, scanning every car that passed through the truck stop lot. Each time headlights appeared, my heart raced, convinced it was the same phantom sedan coming back for me next. You spend enough time on these roads, and you learn to trust your instincts. But lately, my instincts had been whispering that something was very, very wrong. Melissa with her watchers, Luis with his silent pursuer, and me with a stranger who knew my name in the middle of nowhere. I thought maybe it was all coincidence, or maybe something else was happening out here, something that lived in the cracks of America's endless highways. About a month later, I heard Carla Mitchell's story. I was at a truck stop diner in Roanoke, Virginia, drinking coffee at 2 in the morning because sleep had become more of a suggestion than a necessity. Carla came in, dropped into the booth across from me like she recognized me, and asked, "Do you hear them too, the whispers?" I didn't laugh. I didn't ask what she meant. I just nodded, and then she told me what happened to her on the Blue Ridge Parkway. Carla had been trucking for nearly 8 years. She'd picked it up after leaving her nursing job, drawn to the solitude and simplicity of life on the road. But that night, the road wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. She'd been hauling medical supplies through the Appalachian Mountains, navigating the twisting narrow lanes of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The fog had rolled in thick, swallowing the trees on either side of the highway. It was around 1:30 a.m. when she first heard it, a whisper, faint, indistinct, like the soft hiss of static. It drifted through the cab, impossible to pinpoint. At first she figured it was the CB radio. She turned the dial, cycling through channels. The whispering persisted. Then came the voice, soft, breathy, right behind her ear. Carla. She nearly swerved into the guardrail. Her name, spoken clearly, slowly, and with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. Carla's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, nothing but the empty sleeper compartment. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She grabbed the CB mic. "Raker 19, anyone out there on the Blue Ridge Parkway? I've got a weird situation here." The response was static, then a crackle, and then the whisper came through the radio. "Don't look back." Carla's breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't human. There was a guttural edge to it, like wind blowing through broken glass. Her grip tightened on the wheel. The fog thickened outside, her headlights barely cutting through the mist. Her heart pounded as the whisper returned, repeating the same phrase. "Don't look back, don't look back, don't look back." She couldn't help herself. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. That's when she saw it. A pale face staring at her from the back seat. Its eyes were hollow black voids, its skin stretched unnaturally tight across sharp cheekbones. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there in the shadows of the sleeper, watching her. Carla screamed and swerved. The truck's tires screeched against the pavement as she corrected the steering. The whispering grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of disembodied voices, all chanting the same thing. Don't look back. Don't look back. Don't look back. Tears blurred her vision. The icy grip of panic tightened around her chest. The truck rattled as she pushed the accelerator, desperate to outrun whatever had invaded her cab. The voice shifted. No longer a whisper, now it was a growl. Why didn't you listen, Carla? The headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. The engine coughed. Carla's mind raced. She couldn't stop here. Not in the middle of this foggy mountain road. She flipped every switch she could think of. The radio crackled back to life for a split second, emitting a sound that wasn't static, wasn't a voice. It was breathing. Slow and labored. The truck lurched, headlights flickering again. Carla risked a glance at the rearview mirror. The face was gone. The relief that hit her was short-lived. The whispering ceased, replaced by a single, clear voice. Look beside you. Carla's heart stopped. Her gaze shifted to the passenger seat. The figure was sitting there now. It hadn't climbed in, hadn't opened the door. It was just there. A pale, hollow-eyed thing with sunken features and lips stitched together with what looked like coarse black thread. The stitches didn't stop the whispering. The sound seemed to emanate from its very skin, filling the cab with a suffocating presence. Its head tilted toward her, neck cracking with the movement. You looked back, it whispered. Carla screamed and yanked the wheel. The truck veered toward the shoulder. She barely managed to correct in time to avoid slamming into the guardrail. When she looked back, the figure was gone. The whispering stopped. The engine roared back to life, the headlights brightening as if someone had flipped a switch. She drove until dawn, heart racing the entire time. When she finally stopped at a brightly lit truck stop, she sat there for 10 minutes before finding the courage to check the back seat. Nothing. But on the floor of the sleeper were wet, muddy footprints. Bare feet. Carla's hands trembled as she finished her story. I haven't driven through those mountains since, she said, and I don't look in the rearview mirror anymore, not when I'm driving alone. I didn't blame her. I'd heard of strange things in the mountains, voices in the fog, shadow figures stepping into the road before vanishing into thin air. But the stitched mouth figure was new to me. We sat there in silence for a while, the hum of the diner's air conditioning the only sound. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, thick and heavy. Finally, Carla said, "What do you think it wanted?" I didn't know, but I had a theory. It warned you not to look back. Maybe that was a test. Maybe looking back invites it in. Her face paled. What if it comes back? I didn't have an answer for that. She paid her bill and left. I watched her walk across the lot and climb into her rig. Her headlights flared as the engine roared to life. Just as she pulled out, another set of headlights appeared from the far side of the lot. A dark sedan. Faded, rusted. It fell in behind her as she turned onto the highway. I sat there, heart pounding, and did the only thing I could. I didn't look back. After Carla left the diner that night, I sat in my truck and stared into the rearview mirror longer than I should have. Her story lingered like smoke in the air, and my mind kept circling back to that stitched mouth figure whispering from her passenger seat. Don't look back. I didn't. But I didn't sleep either. I started noticing patterns after that night. Truckers, isolated highways, strange encounters that left behind more questions than answers. Like puzzle pieces from different boxes that somehow fit together. And the deeper I thought about it, the more I realized the stories weren't just random incidents. They were warnings. It wasn't just me, it was the roads. About a week later, I heard about Tom Harrison. He was parked 2 spaces down from me at a truck stop in Billings, Montana. I didn't know his name at first. What caught my attention was the way he sat on the edge of his sleeper's steps, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. His rig looked fine, but the man himself looked like he'd just crawled out of a grave. I asked if he needed help. He looked up at me, eyes bloodshot and hollow. "You ever lose a convoy?" "Convoy?" He nodded. "Yeah. The whole damn convoy. Just gone." I didn't laugh. I just leaned against the side of my rig. "Tell me what happened." Tom had been trucking since he was 20, but nothing had shaken him like that night on US Route 212. He was hauling grain through Montana's Badlands. The route was long and lonely, but he wasn't alone that night. He'd teamed up with two other truckers he'd met at a gas station earlier in the evening. Big Mike and Stan. They weren't close friends, just road acquaintances who figured sticking together would make the monotonous drive a little easier. They kept in touch through their CBs, cracking jokes, telling stories, and helping each other stay awake. The night air was crisp, the sky clear. Moonlight cast eerie shadows across the barren landscape. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by rolling hills and jagged rock formations that loomed like forgotten sentinels. Around midnight, Big Mike came over the radio. "Y'all see that?" Tom squinted through the windshield. "See what?" "That road, up ahead, to the right." Tom leaned forward. Sure enough, just beyond the next bend, a narrow dirt road veered off into the darkness. There were no signs, no markers, just a strip of gravel disappearing into the hills. "Didn't know there was a turnoff there," Stan said. "Neither did I," Tom replied. He'd driven that stretch a dozen times. That road had never been there before. "What do you think?" Big Mike asked. Tom hesitated. The air had grown heavier, thicker, like the landscape itself was holding its breath. "I think we stick to the highway," Tom said. Big Mike chuckled. "Where's your sense of adventure, Harrison? Come on, let's check it out." Before Tom could protest, Mike's rig signaled right and rumbled onto the dirt road. Stan followed without hesitation. Tom sat there at the intersection, watching their taillights recede into the night. His instinct screamed at him to stay put, but he couldn't leave them behind, so he turned onto the gravel path and followed. The road was rough, bouncing his rig like a carnival ride. Dust billowed up, obscuring his vision. The taillights of the other two trucks glowed faintly through the haze. He gripped the wheel tighter and pressed forward. A few minutes passed, then 10. The road kept winding through the hills, taking sharp, unnatural turns. His CB crackled. "You guys hear that?" It was Stan's voice, low and uncertain. Tom reached for the mic. "Hear what?" The radio answered with static. Then, faintly, came a sound like distant whispers. Dozens of voices, overlapping. Tom's stomach knotted. "Mike? Stan? Say something." The whispering grew louder. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable, eager. The dust thickened. The taillights ahead of him flickered, and then they were gone. Just like that. No brake lights, no turns, no tire tracks. 1 second they were there, and the next, the road ahead was empty. Tom slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt, gravel crunching beneath the wheels. He grabbed the flashlight and climbed down. The gravel road ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. He stood at the edge, heart hammering in his chest. Below was a ravine, jagged rocks, bathed in pale moonlight. But there were no skid marks, no broken guardrail, no sign that the trucks had gone over. They'd just vanished. He turned back to his rig, flashlight beam dancing across the ground. The gravel road behind him was unmarked except for his own tire tracks. No sign that the other trucks had ever been there. The whispering returned, but this time it came from the CB speaker inside his cab. Tom froze. The flashlight slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the rocks. He scrambled back into the truck, slammed the door, and grabbed the mic. "Who's there?" he demanded. The whispering stopped, silence, and then a voice crackled through. "You should have come with us, Tom. Next time." The voice was familiar. It was Big Mike's. Tom threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning as he backed away from the cliff. The radio screeched with static. The headlights caught movement in the dust. 3 shadowy figures standing just beyond the edge of the ravine, watching, waiting. He didn't stop until he hit the main highway again. He floored it to the nearest town, parked at a gas station, and called the state police. The cops went out there the next day, found the cliff, found his tire tracks, but no sign of another road, no tracks from Big Mike or Stan, no evidence that anyone else had driven into those hills. The police chalked it up to fatigue and imagination. Tom didn't argue. He knew what he'd seen. what he'd heard. If his brother was telling the truth, his grandfather was dead. Even to Tom, by the time Tom finished his story, his hands were trembling. "I know what I heard," he whispered. "Mike's voice, I swear it was him." I nodded. "I believe you." Tom looked up, surprised. "You do?" "Yeah," I said, "because you're not the first person I've heard something like this from. And I doubt you'll be the last." He left not long after. I sat in my cab for hours, staring at my CB radio, wondering if I'd hear a voice whisper my name next. Just before dawn, I keyed the mic and said softly, "Raker 19, anyone out there?" The radio crackled. A voice I didn't recognize whispered back, "We're out here, Jack, just waiting." I turned off the radio. I didn't turn it back on for a long time. After Tom told me about the disappearing convoy, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all tangled in the same web. Different highways, different faces, different horrors, but connected somehow. Like the road itself had become a hunting ground for something ancient, something patient. I tried to convince myself it was just long hours and bad coffee getting to me, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized the fear wasn't just mine. Melissa, Luis, Carla, Tom, we'd all seen different faces of the same predator. And then came Rebecca Simmons. I met her in a truck stop outside Mobile, Alabama. It was late, maybe 1 in the morning, and rain hammered the metal roof of the diner like drumming fingers. She sat in the far corner booth, staring into her untouched coffee. Her clothes were damp, her hands clasped tight around the mug, as if for warmth. Something about her made me pause. I slid into the seat across from her. "You okay?" I asked. She didn't respond at first. Her eyes flicked toward the window, following the streaks of rain sliding down the glass. Finally, she said, "I picked up a passenger tonight." Her voice cracked on the last word. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded for her to continue. Rebecca had been trucking for only a year. She loved the freedom of the road, the quiet stretches where the world seemed to fall away, leaving nothing but her, the engine, and the endless black ribbon of asphalt. That night, she was driving a back road just west of Mobile, hauling a load of seafood bound for Atlanta. The storm had rolled in hard and fast, rain coming down in sheets. Her wipers worked overtime, but visibility was crap. The headlights barely cut through the downpour. Around 11:30 p.m. she saw him. A figure standing on the shoulder, drenched to the bone. His thumb stuck out in the universal gesture of desperation. He wore an old canvas jacket, mud streaked down the sleeves. His hair clung to his forehead in wet, matted strands. Rebecca was cautious about picking up hitchhikers, but something about this guy, his slumped shoulders, the way the rain hammered him into the ground, made her ease off the gas. She figured he'd been caught in the storm and needed a break. She pulled over. The man opened the passenger door without a word. The interior light revealed his face, pale skin, deep-set eyes, lips slightly blue from the cold. He smelled like wet earth and stagnant water. "You okay?" she asked, forcing a smile. He gave a small nod and climbed in. Water pooled immediately beneath his boots. "Where you headed?" she tried again as she merged back onto the road. The man didn't answer. She glanced sideways. His eyes were locked on the road ahead. His hands, pale and bony, gripped the edges of his soaked jacket. The truck's heater hummed as she adjusted the dial to warm the cab. The air filled with the pungent scent of damp soil. Rebecca tried again. "You got a name?" His lips twitched. Not a smile, just a shift, like he was testing the muscles. Then finally he spoke. "Elias." The sound of his voice made Rebecca shiver, low, raspy, like dead leaves scraped across pavement. They drove in silence for nearly 10 minutes. The rain kept pounding the windshield. Rebecca's discomfort grew with each passing second. Elias never shifted in his seat, never moved his hands, never blinked. She cleared her throat. "You from around here, Elias?" The man's head turned slightly toward her, though his eyes stayed on the road. "No." "Where you headed?" "Down the road." Rebecca tightened her grip on the wheel. Her stomach twisted in knots. Something about his voice. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way they seemed to echo, as if the sound came from somewhere deeper than his throat. The truck's radio crackled suddenly. Static filled the cab. Rebecca glanced down at the dial. She hadn't touched it. The static shifted, like something was trying to push through. A voice emerged, faint and distorted. "He doesn't belong here." Rebecca's breath caught. She shot a look at Elias. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. His face was pale and smooth, water still dripping from his hair. The radio crackled again. "He doesn't belong here. Let him go." Rebecca's heart slammed against her ribs. The truck lurched as a sudden gust of wind hit the side. She gripped the wheel tighter and forced herself to breathe. She turned the dial, trying to clear the static. Nothing changed. Elias finally moved. His head turned fully toward her. "Don't listen to it," he said softly. Rebecca forced a nod. Her fingers trembled on the wheel. The headlights caught something ahead. A flash of metal. A rusted guardrail, twisted and bent. Beyond it, darkness yawned like a pit. "What's up there?" she whispered. Elias didn't answer. The radio crackled louder. The voice returned, urgent now. "Let him go. Let him go. Let him go." Rebecca's instincts screamed. She hit the brakes. The truck skidded on the slick pavement, fishtailing. The trailer groaned as the brakes locked. The tires stopped just inches from the shattered guardrail. For a moment, the world stood still except for the rain hammering the windshield. Rebecca's breath came in shallow gasps. She turned to Elias. He was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The seatbelt hung limp at its side. Water still pooled on the vinyl, mud smeared across the floor mat. She looked toward the guardrail. Beyond it, the ground dropped into a steep ravine. At the bottom, barely visible in the dim glow of her headlights, lay the rusted wreckage of an old truck. Rebecca climbed out, ignoring the rain drenching her within seconds. She walked to the edge of the ravine and shined her flashlight down. The truck below was crumpled beyond recognition, but the logo on the side was faintly visible. Henderson Freight Co., the same company she worked for. The mud shifted beneath her feet. She knelt and shined the flashlight on the ground near the guardrail. Footprints, bare and shallow, leading from the edge of the road to her truck. And then she saw the name etched into the guardrail, scratched deep into the rusted metal. Elias Henderson, 1994. Rebecca finished her story with haunted eyes. "The police came," she said. "Said the truck down there went off the road during a storm. 30 years ago. Driver's body was never found." I exhaled slowly. "Elias Henderson," she nodded. "Yeah. They said he was trying to make a delivery that night, got caught in a landslide and went over the edge." She rubbed her arms. "He wasn't supposed to be on that road. Dispatch screwed up, sent him the wrong way." The rain had stopped outside. The air felt brittle and thin. "What do you think he wanted?" I asked. She gave a weak laugh. "I don't know. But if I hadn't stopped, if I hadn't heard that voice on the radio," her words trailed off. We sat in silence. Finally she stood, paid for her untouched coffee, and left. I watched her go. My eyes drifted to the window as she climbed into her truck and turned on the headlights. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the glow, tall, gaunt, clothes soaked, mud streaking his jacket. His eyes met mine through the rain-slicked glass. He smiled and raised his thumb. Just like that night on Route 50. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. When I blinked, he was gone. The next morning, I found a note tucked into my cab's door handle. "See you soon, Jack." My name again. I've been driving for over 20 years, but these days, I keep the radio off, and I never ever stop for strangers. The road has always been a place of solitude, a stretch of asphalt where time blurs, and the world feels like it exists in fragments. But if there's one thing these stories have taught me, it's that the road isn't as empty as we think. There's something out there, lingering just beyond the reach of our headlights, watching, waiting. The stories you've just heard weren't just random tales of fear. They were warnings. Jack's encounter with the stranger on Route 50 reminds us that help doesn't always come with good intentions. In the isolation of the desert, where the world falls away, a seemingly helpful face can conceal something far darker. If you ever break down on an empty road, lock your doors and stay inside. Not everyone who stops is there to lend a hand. Melissa's experience at the Ridgeway rest stop reveals a terrifying truth. Some places should be left alone. The watchers that circled her truck weren't simply trying to scare her. They were testing the boundaries of her fear. Rest stops are supposed to offer safety, but when the silence feels too heavy and the shadows move just a little too naturally, it's time to leave. When your instincts tell you something is wrong, Luis Alvarez learned the hard way that not everything on the road follows the rules of physics. The car that followed him along the extraterrestrial highway was more than just a phantom. It was a predator. If a vehicle tracks you for too long, stays at a fixed distance no matter your speed, don't stop. Keep moving until you reach a well-lit, populated area. Darkness gives these things their power. Light forces them to retreat. Carla Mitchell's encounter on the fog-covered Blue Ridge Parkway taught us an unsettling lesson. Curiosity can kill more than a cat. When the whispers told her not to look back, they weren't giving advice. They were issuing a command, and when she disobeyed, something slipped through the cracks. If you ever feel the urge to glance over your shoulder, resist it. Some passengers don't need doors to get inside. Tom Harrison followed a convoy into the Montana Badlands and discovered that some roads appear only to claim victims. His friends followed an unmarked path into oblivion, guided by whispers on the CB radio. If you ever encounter a road that shouldn't exist, one you don't remember, one with no signs or tire marks, don't take it. Curiosity is the bait. The road is the trap. And finally, Rebecca Simmons met a passenger who wasn't supposed to be there. Elias Henderson died decades before she picked him up, yet there he sat, dripping with rainwater and regret. Ghostly hitchhikers are more common than you think, especially on back roads near old accident sites. If someone appears in a storm with empty eyes and muddy boots, keep driving. Not all passengers want a ride. Some just want company for the long road ahead. The road can be beautiful, peaceful, but remember this, it's also old, and old things collect ghosts. Stay cautious, trust your instincts, lock your doors, and never stop for strangers. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the shadowed highways of America. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Here at Enigma of the Unknown, we bring you tales from the darkest corners of the world, because the unknown is always closer than you think. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes, the scariest thing on the road isn't what you see in front of you, it's what follows behind. Until next time, drive carefully. We'll be waiting in the next nightmare.